What a bruising day it was in round 7 of the Biel Grandmaster tournament. Peter Svidler defeated Nico Georgiadis. Shahriar Mamedyarov defeated David Navarra. And then there was the game between Magnus Carlsen with white and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave with black. This was a really incredible encounter with both players showing real class, real resourcefulness. Well, first of all, it was a Najdorf, Vachier-Lagrave playing his favourite Najdorf variation, and you can see that Carlsen has gone in for an English attack with white. Now, he doesn't usually play this kind of thing with white. We see him sometimes playing with h3, sometimes side variations. We saw him play bishop g5 against Svidler earlier in the tournament, but Vachier-Lagrave is theoretically far better prepared than Svidler in this Najdorf variation. So Carlsen understandably didn't go for bishop g5. Nevertheless, this is very, very theoretical, one of the main lines. Vachier-Lagrave has gone h5 to prevent g4. This is actually a pretty standard idea. And Carlsen plays here not castle's queenside, which can lead to very sharp positions, but instead knight d5. So this knight has to be eliminated. And then g6. So we have this pretty familiar pawn structure with white having a majority of pawns on the queen side, black having a majority of pawns on the king side. We saw something similar in the game between Georgiadis and Mamedyarov in round 6, not so long ago. And there Mamedyarov managed to crash through on the king side. So that is one of black's big aims here, is to try and advance this f-pawn. Now, Vachier-Lagrave has had this before. He played b6 against Topalov and, well, managed to win, but it was pretty unclear. Instead, here today he played a5. An interesting move, because it's hard for white to find a good square for that knight. In some positions, if you can imagine a position with the pawn on c4, then the queen could drop back, making room for the knight to come to d2. You don't really want to, let's say play c4 and have the knight go back to c1. It's not the best square for it. So Carlsen, after 10 minutes thought, decided to block that pawn. Now it looks funny to allow this light squared bishop onto this nice square here, supported by the pawn. But the point is that in a position like this, you can see that with the pawns on a5 and a4, white's queenside majority is rather stymied here. Even if this knight moves, then if a pawn comes to b4, this can just be eliminated and the knight sits nicely on c5. So in that sense, black is doing pretty well, because his pawn majority on the king side, well, it has a long way to go before it starts mobilizing. But when it does, then, well, it's a proper majority, whereas white's queenside majority doesn't look so healthy now. Then again, this bishop has a nice square sometimes on c6. We'll see how that's important in a moment. h3 from Carlsen. That's actually a very important move, because sometimes black would like to play e4 to open up the e-file, open up this long diagonal. But in this position, white can keep things closed with f4. And you can see that now knight g4 is no longer possible because the pawn covers g4. That's why h3 was played. Knight c5. Looks decent. White doesn't really want to live with that knight, so that was exchanged off. And here is Carlsen's idea. Rook a3. So this one is coming around to b3. And wants to creep in to the queen side after bishop c6. And Vachier-Lagrave gets going the kingside pawn majority. And here is where we come to first critical moments in the game. Afterwards, Carlsen thought that perhaps Queen E1 would be better than his game continuation, because after F4, the bishop comes to D2, looking at the A5 pawn. And then white can perhaps go for things with bishop C6. Well, in the meantime, black has some play on the king side as well, so it's very unclear. And of course, F4 isn't necessary after Queen E1. Anyway, that's another story. So bishop C6 was played, which looks pretty natural. I was expecting black to play rook A7 here to keep an eye on the A pawn, but also to prevent the rook coming to B7. And this is just a very double-edged position. In fact, I thought here perhaps Queen E1 would be possible, followed by rook B5 and bishop D2. But black's kingside play not to be underestimated. Anyway, bishop C6 played, and now rook B8 and rook B5. Black doesn't want to exchange off the rooks here, because that gives white a strong passed B pawn and the possibility to attack the A pawn with rook A1. And you'll notice it's not possible to play rook A8 because that square is covered by the bishop. So that rook has just moved in and wants to take on A5. Looks very nice indeed. At this moment we were thinking Carlsen is looking very good here, but watch what happens. Time for some counterplay on the other side of the board. First of all, F4, and then E4, opening the bishop's diagonal. And if, let's say, pawn takes pawn, let's switch this queen over to the king side. Forget the A pawn, just ditch that. And, well, the queen is looking here. We might play knight G5, might play F3. Suddenly, black's pieces are concentrating on the king side, and then you have to ask yourself the question, what are white's rook and bishop doing way across the other side of the board? But Carlsen, after E4, had prepared a good response. He played Queen C2, very clever, and this was not anticipated by Maxime. Now, if E3, then the bishop simply drops to E1, and that's looking in the right place, and there's still a threat to take on G6. There's also pawn takes pawn, but queen takes G6 again. This is, of course, the point of putting the queen on this diagonal. And that seems to be pretty nice for white. The king can always drop to H1, and then the rook comes into play, or possibly comes into play via E1 as well. That looks very nice for white. So after Queen C2, Maxime played Queen E7 after almost 20 minutes thought. And it's fascinating to see what happens now. King H1 is interesting. And the idea of this is that after knight G5, which looks quite threatening, then white can play bishop H4, pinning, because with the king on H1 there's no longer the tactical trick knight takes pawn check and queen takes bishop. So that's at least one of the points of king H1. But instead Carlsen just went for the endgame, and who could blame him? It feels like he's about to win a pawn on this side of the board, and doesn't seem to be any particular danger. But it's incredible how black's initiative really develops here. The knight comes into play, threatening the pawn. Rook E1 defends. Now knight F7. So this knight just wants to jump around here. It's one possibility. Also, bishop takes pawn is threatened. Rook B1 defends the pawn. And now Maxime just moved the knight back to g5. It's interesting. So Carlsen could have had a draw here with rook e1. It's interesting, just coming back to this position after knight f7. So this is threatened. If b3, then this is not so clear because the bishop comes to c3 and locks itself in on b4, and then there's no problem with the a pawn. And black certainly has compensation here after knight e5, f3, these kind of moves. Okay, back we go. Rook b1, this was the game. Knight g5. So Carlsen has a draw if he wants with rook e1. But no, he takes on a5. But after this move, he began to regret his decision. He said this was unforgivable because after rook b5, he just forgot that the rook could switch across to d3. Why is this significant? Because suddenly all black's pieces, two rooks, bishop and knight, not to mention this pawn, start to attack white's king. And you can see there's only a bishop covering the king, and it's incredible how strong black's attack is. Maybe it's not so incredible with the sheer weight of numbers, but basically this a pawn, which is waiting in the wings, well, it's touch and go, but actually black's attack should be too strong. Well, there's a couple of possibilities here. b4 is interesting, just to bring this rook into the game, but then, well, a couple of moves. Bishop d4 or rook d2 give black a pretty serious initiative. My computer likes e5 with the idea after bishop takes pawn, rook e1 with potential to sacrifice an exchange here. But certainly white is not better in this position. You know, white is hanging on here. But instead, Carlsen played rook e1 to defend this pawn. And now f3, things start to open up. So simple threat to take here. And if g3, then knight takes h3. So this pawn on f3 is undermining white's pawns here and, well, just breaking through to white's king too. h4 from Carlsen. And here is the crunch moment in the game. Vachier-Lagrave, after less than a minute, retreated the knight to f7, which is certainly not a bad move, a very good practical move. And Carlsen is absolutely on the edge there. He could, however, have won in this position with an extraordinary move. Well, I was commentating live on this game, and suddenly we noticed on in the comments on YouTube and you know, people tweeting, rook d2, Magnus is lost. And this incredible move, found by computers, of course, is a win. And here's the extraordinary way that black can win. So black is a piece down, but this bishop is threatened. So bishop e3 looks normal, and after this it appears as though black has nothing. But with rook c2, a really slow motion move, in fact black is winning this position. The basic threat is this. Let me show you. a5. Let's push this pawn, and then we'll soon discover what the threat is. Then bishop e5. Still doesn't look like anything serious. Now rook f1 check. Bishop h2. And discover check, and you make a queen, and obviously that's mate very shortly. So that is the big idea. But of course, you're never going to find this incredible move, rook c2, and imagine that black is actually winning this position when white has, you know, a few moves, a move basically to defend. Basically, you know, you're going to give up this variation here, as Maxime did. Instead, he played a very practical move, knight f7. Now let's go on. So this knight just threatening spin round into this position and then open up the f file again. Magnus push the pawn. Well, really, this is the best defense. And now, crunch moment again, and Magnus has a choice. Do you get a queen, or do you play rook b8? Rook b8, obviously the most ambitious because you want to get a new queen. But now we can see the strength of Black's attack. In fact, well, the players after the game demonstrated a very long variation here. If White makes a queen, then Black delivers checkmate. Like this. And bishop d4. So first of all, White has to eliminate the rook here and then get a queen. Now in this endgame, there's no doubt that Black is better. White may be able to hang on here. The players basically had looked at this position, and Black has winning chances here. So another very long variation, and actually very well calculated by both players. So instead of rook b8, a8 queen by Carlsen. And now we have another forcing variation actually. The rook is taken, the king is in check, must come out. Now, Black can't checkmate, of course, because you need the second rook, and that rook is pinned. So Black has to take the queen. Carlsen takes the most active rook. So we reach an endgame where, in fact, Carlsen is a pawn up, but he has to react quickly because this bishop is such a bad piece. Black's bishop is wonderful. The rook is threatening 2 pawns. White has to be really careful. It's essential that he tries to create trouble with b4. And now if rook takes e4, this leads to a drawn endgame. Like so. And d6. Opposite colour bishops shouldn't present White with any problems. So pawn takes pawn by Vachier-Lagrave, c5. So Carlsen wants to get the d pawn rolling. If that's taken here, then d6 and so on. Looks good. So bishop e5 and pawn takes pawn. King d3, good move, covering the e pawn. And now here Carlsen plays an excellent move. He has to be extremely careful. If that king marches up the board and then we can check White's king backwards, maybe sometimes taking here, then actually the king, bishop, rook, and sometimes even pawn can combine to attack White's king. So this is a superb move, rook b6 from Carlsen. So let's see what would happen if rook takes pawn. Then we can give a check. And if king e7, we can even play e5 there. The tactics work for White. And otherwise, well, Black has to be very careful here. White certainly has control there with these further advanced central pass pawns. Or what about king f6? Then we come up the board. I don't want to allow the king into e5, so now there's a threat to move the bishop. And if check, whoops, sorry, this position, and now bishop e8 check, and we're going to take this pawn, and that's good enough for White to draw. So after rook b6, excellent move by Carlsen, bishop c5 from Vachier-Lagrave, the rook came back, attacking the bishop went back, and so on, and they repeated moves and agreed to draw. Fascinating game. I think the win that Vachier-Lagrave had there was so difficult. It's no surprise that you didn't spot it. I mean, it's a study-like move. And he actually played a very good move, a very practical move. And I thought Carlsen did brilliantly, actually, to find a way through. He had to calculate extremely deeply to check that this endgame, for example, was tenable for him. He played really precisely. In the end, I think both players were quite relieved. Maxime perhaps didn't start very well in the game, so he was relieved he made a draw. And Magnus, well, he admitted after the game that he was absolutely terrified once Black's counterattack started rolling, and in a sense, well, I think he calculated extremely well, but yeah, he was lucky in some ways to survive this. I don't know, he created his own luck anyway. So after that draw, that leaves Magnus Carlsen a full point behind Vachier-Lagrave with just 3 rounds to go. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do check out the PowerPlayChess Patreon page. If you'd consider supporting us, we'd be very grateful indeed. Thanks very much for watching.